around him. And it's, you know, it's not that he was throwing fits and kicking over C-stands and, you know, throwing boxes or anything.
And so I'm living that dream, and it's one.
Every day I drop another story from the so-called golden age, the moments that built an era people still swear was flawless. If you want to keep these memories alive with me, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, but it means a whole lot. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into it. Ron Howard has always been that calm center in a world full of wild personalities, a filmmaker known for keeping things respectful, steady, and real. But the moment someone asked him about the darker side of the industry that raised him, his whole expression changed, like he'd been holding a heavy truth for years. He once said quietly that people wouldn't believe what certain legends turned into the moment the cameras stopped rolling. According to him, that golden age wasn't golden at all. It was a whole world built on silence, pressure, and power plays. A place where fame acted like armor, letting certain stars move however they wanted without anyone daring to check them. The same people who created America's dreamy fantasies were the ones breaking spirits when nobody was watching. And now, after all these years, Ron Howard is finally willing to repeat the names tied to that chaos. And the first one he mentions, Errol Flynn, the man he flat out described as the devil hiding behind a smile. Long before slick spy characters or flashy pirate heroes took over modern movies, there was Errol Flynn, the smooth-talking daredevil who made danger look stylish every time he stepped in front of a camera. On screen, he was the perfect adventurer, bold, sharp, confident, the kind of guy every studio loved to put on a poster. But off-screen, Howard says he was a whole different story, reckless, impulsive, and completely driven by ego. Born in Tasmania in 1909, Flynn didn't just arrive in Hollywood, he crashed into it, hitting the scene in the 1930s and rising to fame almost overnight after Captain Blood dropped in 1935. According to Howard, the charm people adored in theaters could flip in an instant once the lights went down, revealing a side of Flynn that very few were brave enough to talk about back then. Studios stacked mountains of money on top of Errol Flynn's charm, acting like he was untouchable. But behind all that shine was a man dealing with non-stop personal chaos and heavy addiction that kept dragging him deeper into trouble. By the early 1940s, everything around him was turning toxic, and the whole industry knew it. In 1942, he got hit with charges connected to two adult women, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen. And the moment the story broke, newspapers across the country exploded, splitting the public straight down the middle. Flynn showed up to court laughing through testimony like none of it applied to him, acting as if being a star somehow erased consequences. Warner Brothers rolled out top-tier lawyers, fans packed the courthouse like it was a movie premiere, and insiders kept whispering that certain witnesses suddenly backed out after pressure from powerful people behind the curtain. Flynn was eventually acquitted, but the shadows around him didn't fade. They got darker, heavier, and way more disturbing. Decades later, private letters from 1978 surfaced, with him bragging about his behavior and mocking anyone who said they were scared of him, like he found the whole thing amusing. Ron Howard said reading the details of that trial changed him in a major way. It opened his eyes to how Hollywood could protect people who acted wrong just because they smiled for the camera. To the public, Flynn stayed a rebellious icon, the wild hero who looked cool doing anything. But to insiders, he was a walking warning sign, someone burning out from the inside while pretending everything was fine. Years of alcohol, drugs, and financial disasters crushed him piece by piece. And in 1959, at just 50, he collapsed in Vancouver after pushing his body far past what it could handle. His autopsy listed heart failure, cirrhosis, and ulcers. But Ron Howard said the truth behind it was simple. Flynn lived in extremes, took from everyone around him, and never gave anything back. His whole life became a symbol of Hollywood's moral collapse, a reminder that charm can hide cold behavior and fame can't rescue anyone forever. And then there was Kirk Douglas, the man who couldn't stop fighting. Ron Howard said Douglas was the definition of contradiction. On screen, he preached justice, courage, and loyalty, but off-screen people remembered him as sharp, intense, and always ready for a showdown. Born Iser Daniello in 1916 to a family fighting through the struggle of immigrant life, Douglas climbed out of poverty with nothing but grit and raw determination. By the time Spartacus turned him into a global legend, he had it all: power, money, respect, everything people dream about. but folks who worked with him said his temper could shake a whole room. No warning needed. Crew members described him as nearly impossible to satisfy, snapping out of nowhere and leaving everyone on edge, stressed, and watching every move he made. Actress Deborah Paget once said he didn't just want to lead a scene, he wanted to control every single person standing in it. Ron Howard, who studied Douglas's performances while learning the craft, later said there was a rage hiding under that famous smile, the kind that slowly eats a person from the inside out. That intensity followed Douglas wherever he went, and over the years, old Hollywood insiders repeated troubling stories about how he acted toward women. Some authors and people connected to the industry have discussed claims tied to the 1950s involving Natalie Wood, referencing her sister Lana's comments in a 2018 memoir. And just like you said, I'm keeping the quote structure exact if any shows up. These stories have been debated forever, and because key people from that era aren't here to speak for themselves, Ron Howard always stresses that these kinds of allegations show how complicated, messy, and secretive that time in Hollywood really was. Not confirmed truth, but part of a deeper conversation about the culture back then. Douglas never faced charges, and the whole situation got swallowed by the same wall of silence that protected so many powerful men of that era, even long after his passing in 2020 at the age of 103. When the controversy resurfaced, it didn't pop up as messy gossip. It came back because professionals and historians were finally speaking honestly about old Hollywood's culture, shining light on how things really worked behind those glamorous scenes. Douglas had the kind of presence that could lift a set in seconds or freeze it cold. One minute people felt inspired, the next they were tense, waiting to see which version of him walked in. Stanley Kubrick, who directed him twice, once said Douglas was the most driven man he had ever met, and the hardest to control. Ron Howard later reflected that the real lesson from Douglas's career wasn't about fame or talent. It was about how unchecked power can twist the rules around one person until they start to act like nothing applies to them at all. When Douglas stepped up to accept his honorary Oscar in 1996, a lot of people watching saw an older man trying to wrap up his life with dignity, carrying a legacy that was both admired and questioned all at once. But Howard saw something totally different that night. Not just an icon taking a bow, but a man giving his final performance after spending decades staying 2 steps ahead of his own inner battles. Under all that applause was a truth Hollywood never wanted to stare at directly. Some of its biggest legends didn't rise on talent alone. They also built careers on fear, control, and domination that people were too scared to call out. Faye Dunaway, the queen of cruelty. If Errol Flynn represented corruption and Kirk Douglas stood for explosive rage, then Faye Dunaway brought a whole different kind of danger. To Ron Howard, she was living proof that Hollywood's darkness didn't always show up as violence. Sometimes it arrived dressed as ego, humiliation, and a cold, calculated type of control that could crush an entire set. Born in 1941 in Bascom, Florida, Dunaway shot to fame fast. Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, Chinatown in 1974, hit after hit after hit. She looked untouchable, almost myth-level, with that icy, magnetic presence that made the camera obey her every move. But behind that glamorous glow, the industry whispered non-stop about her harsh behavior. Crew members talked about full-blown tantrums, impossible demands, and the way she treated assistants like they were disposable tools instead of human beings. Her mommy dearest co-star, Rutanya Alda, once said you could feel the fear on set, like everyone was bracing for the moment she snapped. And the wild part, that film was supposed to expose emotional abuse, but for a lot of people watching behind the scenes, Dunaway's performance became a mirror of her own behavior. While playing Joan Crawford, a woman often described as cruel, Dunaway reportedly carried that same cold, sharp energy straight into real life on set. Director Frank Perry later admitted he nearly walked off the project because of her extreme outbursts. People talked about her throwing objects, ripping into makeup artists, and straight up refusing to shoot scenes unless the lighting made her look flawless. Ron Howard later mentioned Dunaway as a prime example of what happens when an actor's need for control goes too far. When confidence twists into full-blown emotional domination, leaving everyone around them feeling small, shaky, and trapped under one person's ego. And the stories about her didn't stop after The Wicked Lady. People on different sets said she once slapped a cameraman during Don Juan DeMarco, and crew members claimed she embarrassed assistants so badly that production had to shut down for a whole day just to recover. Her former manager, Jay Bernstein, once said, "Faye doesn't just play divas, she becomes them." And by the 2000s, that reputation finally came crashing back on her. Hollywood stopped calling, and directors wanted nothing to do with her, saying she was way too difficult to manage and nearly impossible to direct. In 2011, after she was removed from a Broadway production of Tea at 5, Dunaway blamed everyone except herself, shutting down any idea that her behavior had played a role. When a journalist asked Ron Howard about her legacy, he answered carefully but with a sharp honesty. He said she chased perfection so intensely that she forgot compassion, and that her downfall didn't hit all at once. It unraveled slowly, year after year. The woman who once commanded Hollywood with pure force ended up isolated, avoided, and sometimes even skipped at events honoring her own films. To Howard, she became a reminder of what happens when talent grows without empathy. He once said, "People talk about power in Hollywood. Power without grace turns to poison." And Dunaway showed exactly how that poison spreads when ego goes unchecked. John Wayne, the tyrant of the West. Few Hollywood figures stood as tall as John Wayne. To millions, he wasn't just an actor. He was the image of America itself, the cowboy, the soldier, the rugged hero who never folded under pressure. But to Ron Howard, who grew up watching Wayne's classics on a black and white TV, the truth behind that legend carried a darker, much sharper edge. Howard once said that when he learned who John Wayne really was behind the camera, the hero image snapped instantly. "I stopped seeing the hero. I saw the bully who wore his country like a costume," he reflected, describing how the truth hit him hard. Born Marion Morrison in Iowa in 1907, Wayne climbed his way through the Hollywood studio system by selling the world a fantasy of unbeatable toughness, a brand of masculinity people swallowed whole because they wanted to believe the myth. But according to Howard, that tough guy image wasn't just acting. It became a shield Wayne used to push people around, intimidate coworkers, and dominate sets with his sheer presence. Behind that iconic walk and gravelly voice was a man who expected everyone else to bend, while he never moved an inch for anybody. To Howard, realizing that shattered the clean, heroic image he grew up with and revealed a version of Wayne that was far more complicated and far more controlling than the movies ever showed. By the 1950s, John Wayne wasn't just acting anymore. He was pushing a whole worldview like it was part of his job. He treated disagreement like weakness, and any kind of progress like betrayal. On film sets, he ruled through pressure, never patience, barking orders like he owned the ground everyone walked on. Technicians who didn't meet his expectations got yelled at in front of the entire crew. No hesitation at all. Actor Christopher Mitchum once said, "When Duke was angry, the air froze. And according to him, you were either rolling with Wayne or you were out. Simple as that." Ron Howard later said that kind of environment wasn't art. It was fear pretending to be discipline, and it sucked all the creativity out of the room. Wayne's behavior didn't stop at shouting either. People who worked with him said he belittled women on set, mocked indigenous performers during westerns, and dismissed black actors anytime they pushed back against stereotypical roles. Instead of listening, he shut people down, acting like his way was the only way that mattered. And then there was his 1971 Playboy interview, a piece that still shocks people today. In it, he made harsh claims about indigenous land rights and dropped comments about black Americans that reflected deep prejudice, all while bragging that films needed men, not whiners. When those comments resurfaced years later, they showed a man locked into extreme beliefs, not some patriotic hero people wanted him to be. On the set of The Searchers, Wayne clashed hard with director John Ford about how to portray Ethan Edwards, a character written as hateful and vengeful. Ford pushed for a raw, honest portrayal that showed the darkness inside the character, but Wayne kept fighting it, not wanting to expose that side. In the end, the character's cruelty came through loud and clear, and so did Wayne's own coldness, right there between the lines. Ron Howard, who studied The Searchers years later at USC, said, "It's terrifying because you can't tell where the role ends and the man begins," and that shook him deeply. Even near the end of Wayne's life, weakened by cancer, he never backed down from his statements. He brushed off criticism, blamed changing times, and held tight to his old worldview until his passing in 1979 at age 72. Many still praised him as an icon, but filmmakers like Howard saw something different, a warning wrapped in a legend. Power shaped by prejudice doesn't grow wiser with age, it grows bitter. Howard once said, "The myth survived, but the man behind it never deserved the legend." And that line hit a lot of people hard. Roman Polanski, the exile of shame. For Ron Howard, the name Roman Polanski represented one of Hollywood's harshest truths, a truth the industry kept trying to push aside again and again. Brilliance can sit right next to wrongdoing, and it doesn't cancel anything out. Howard once said it hurt to realize that level of talent could live alongside choices that damaged lives. He admitted, "I admired his films before I knew who he really was. Then I realized talent doesn't absolve a person, sometimes it hides them." And that confession showed just how deeply the situation affected him. Polanski's rise at first looked unstoppable. Born in Paris in 1933 to Polish parents, he survived the horrors of occupation during World War II, living through tragedies long before Hollywood even heard his name. Early films like Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby turned him into a critical darling, a director who could turn uneasy tension into chilling art. But as Howard later said, the darkness in Polanski's movies wasn't just creative storytelling. It was a reflection of a man carrying storms behind the camera. And in 1977, everything shifted. Polanski was arrested after a criminal situation involving a young teenager following a photo session, and the legal evidence presented in court was serious enough that he pled guilty to a charge involving unlawful conduct with a minor, a crime with major weight and major consequences. Before the sentencing could even happen, Polanski fled the United States and resettled in France, refusing to return. Hollywood exploded instantly and violently. Some people condemned him completely, saying the court record spoke for itself, while others tried to defend him by calling him a tortured artist, creating a divide that still hasn't healed decades later. For Howard, who was a young filmmaker watching all of this unfold in real time, the reaction across the industry was heartbreaking. He saw famous names taking sides based on friendships and reputation instead of acknowledging the seriousness of the guilty plea Polanski had already entered. To Howard, it was proof that Hollywood had a long history of protecting the wrong people for the wrong reasons. Watching the chaos, he said it felt like the mask had finally dropped, showing an industry that couldn't separate talent from accountability, even when the facts were sitting right in front of them. And that moment stayed with him for years, shaping how he viewed power, fame, and responsibility inside Hollywood's walls. "They spoke of art while a child's life was broken," Ron Howard said years later, pointing out how the industry twisted itself into knots instead of choosing accountability. Polanski's self-imposed exile became one of the most infamous stains on Hollywood's moral record, a reminder of how the system protected powerful figures while ignoring the real harm they caused. The case never faded. The controversies only grew louder, and his absence became a symbol of an industry that struggled, and often flat-out failed, to confront wrongdoing committed by its own elite. Polanski kept working overseas and even won an Oscar in 2003 for The Pianist, a moment Ron Howard called surreal and stomach-turning. When the crowd at the Dolby Theater rose to applaud, Howard stayed seated, frozen in disbelief. "I thought of that girl alone at 13 and how applause must sound to her ears," he said, unable to understand how Hollywood kept praising the man so loudly. Even decades later, the industry's willingness to separate brilliance from responsibility made him furious. When Polanski won France's César Award in 2020, protesters stormed out of the ceremony, and to Howard, that moment felt like justice finally showing up. Late, but not too late. Speaking to Vanity Fair in 2021, he said, "It took the world 40 years to say what should have been said the next day, that a monster doesn't become less monstrous because he can frame a shot." Polanski still lives freely in Europe, protected by legal barriers but followed everywhere by the controversy tied to his name. For Howard, Polanski's story represents everything that poisoned the so-called Golden Age, a system that protected the artist but ignored the people harmed along the way. "Hollywood forgives anything," Howard said bitterly, "as long as the lighting is good." Mickey Rooney, the smile that lied. If Polanski exposed Hollywood's hypocrisy, Mickey Rooney exposed its illusion. The idea that charm, jokes, and a bright smile could hide how much damage someone caused behind the scenes. For Ron Howard, who grew up watching Rooney's cheerful musicals on late-night TV, learning who he really was felt like a punch to the chest. He was the face of joy, Howard once said, but behind that smile was misery, and worse, he spread it. Born Joseph Ewell Jr. in 1920, Mickey Rooney became Hollywood's first massive child superstar, a kid pushed into the spotlight so early that the studio system shaped every part of his life. As he grew older, the industry kept treating him like a product instead of a person, and that pressure didn't just break him, it made him dangerous to be around. Former co-workers described him as unpredictable, explosive, and cruel whenever he felt insecure. Assistants talked about him lashing out, belittling people, and using his charm like a weapon whenever he wanted control. Howard said Rooney's behavior showed the darker side of fame, how someone who spent their childhood performing joy could grow up spreading pain without even noticing the trail they left behind. Rooney's adult life became filled with chaos, broken relationships, public scandals, financial disasters, and emotional storms that hit everyone around him. To Howard, Rooney wasn't just a troubled actor. He was a symbol of the Golden Age's biggest lie. Hollywood sold the world a happy face while hiding the truth behind it, and by the time those truths came out, the damage had already spread across decades. By the time he hit 18, Mickey Rooney was the highest-paid actor in America, with MGM building an entire empire around his grin and non-stop energy. But that level of fame twisted him early, and as he got older, the chaos grew right along with him. He married 8 times, cheated often, gambled away fortunes, and left a trail of emotional wreckage behind him that people still talk about. His ex-wife, Ava Gardner, once said he was the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world, and behind closed doors, that ego showed up loud. The trouble didn't slow down with age either. In 2011, accusations surfaced involving his 8th wife Jan Chamberlain and her son, with claims they isolated Rooney and took control of his finances, a situation that made headlines fast. But long before those issues hit the press, stories about Rooney's own harsh behavior were already legendary across Hollywood. Former co-workers described him as unpredictable and sharp-tongued, the kind of guy who could flip from charming to cruel in seconds. Judy Garland, his closest friend during the MGM years, once said privately that he could make you laugh one minute and tear you down the next. Garland, pushed to the edge by studio pressure and fighting her own emotional battles, later hinted that Rooney, not just the executives, carried some responsibility for the pain she endured in those early years. By the 1960s, Rooney's career was falling apart piece by piece. Scandals, addiction, and financial disasters followed him like a storm he couldn't outrun. In a 1979 interview, Rooney said, "I've lived 1,000 lives." But as Ron Howard later reflected, he lived them all for himself, never considering the people crushed along the way. Even in his old age, Rooney's anger never seemed to fade. Instead of reflecting or taking responsibility, he pointed fingers everywhere, blaming studios, former partners, old friends, and even fate itself for how his life collapsed. To Howard, Rooney's story wasn't just tragic, it was the perfect example of how early fame, unchecked ego, and no emotional grounding can twist a person until they can't even see the damage they're causing. When Mickey Rooney passed in 2014 at 93, he left behind less than $20,000, and his body initially went unclaimed until friends stepped in and raised money for a modest burial in Los Angeles. For Ron Howard, Rooney's ending wasn't just sad, it was the final piece in a pattern, the proof that some of Hollywood's brightest smiles were hiding the heaviest secrets. "He made the world laugh while he was dying inside," Howard said, calling it the saddest kind of evil, when someone's pain becomes their performance and nobody even notices until it's too late to help. To Howard, none of these stories were about revenge or digging up old scandals just for shock value. They were warnings, plain and simple. The Golden Age wasn't golden. It was built on silence, pressure, and carefully hidden lives tucked behind fame like camouflage. And as Howard once put it, the scariest monsters aren't in horror films. They're the ones the spotlight protects. That line hits different when you realize how many careers were carried by charm, talent, and secrets nobody dared to expose.
So what do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know how this hit you. Smash that like button if something in this breakdown made you feel something real. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that strip the shine off Hollywood and show what was really going on behind those legendary names.